The story of Orpheus and Eurydice. The deeds of the immortal gods were told and sung at every fireside in Greece, and among these hero tales there was none more popular than the story of how Apollo built for Neptune the famous walls of Troy. Many musicians would have been glad to perform a similar service, for the mere fame it would bring them, but they feared that the attempt to imitate Apollo would only result in failure and ridicule. So no mortal ever presumed to say that he could make rocks and stones obedient to the spell of his music. There was, however, one musician, Amphion, the king of Thebes, who was anxious to prove that his playing was equal to Apollo's. But knowing how unwise it was to vie with an immortal, he determined not to test his skill publicly, but to carry out his cherished plan at night, when men were dreaming in their beds. He was eager to build a high wall around Thebes, and to build it as Apollo did the walls of Troy. So when the sun set and the darkness crept over the earth, Amphion stood just outside the city gates, and he began to play his lyre. Immediately the stones rose from the ground and moved rhythmically into their places in the wall, which soon rose strong and high, a firmer defense than any that could be built by the hands of men. Another famous musician was Arion, who won not only the praise for his great skill in playing, but also much wealth. Whenever a contestant was held in which a prize of money was given, Arion was usually there to compete, and his music was really finer than that of most players. He easily won the reward. Once he was returning from a festival in Sicily, whither many musicians had gone on account for the rich prize, and as he had come off victor, he was leaving those foreign shores laden with much gold. Unfortunately, he happened to embark on a ship owned by pirates who had heard much of his great wealth, and were plotting to seize whatever part of it he had on board. Well, the easiest way was to simply kill him. The pirates began to bind him with ropes, that he might not be able to struggle when thrown overboard. Poor Arion calmly accepted his fate, but begged the brutal crew to allow him to play once upon his lyre before going to his doom. To this the pirates agreed, and when the wonderful music filled the air, a school of dolphins swam toward the ship and kept close behind it, charmed by Arion's playing. Feeling sure that there was some sort of magic in the music, the pirates hastened to throw the player and his lyre into the sea without waiting to bind him. But Arion did not drown as they had expected, for a friendly dolphin caught him on its back and swam with him back to the shore, where he landed in safety. When in the course of time Arion did die, the gods placed him, together with his lyre and the kindly dolphin, in the sky as constellations. The most famous of all musicians, except the one who played in the shining halls of Olympus, of course, was Orpheus, the son of Apollo and the muse of Calliope. When he was a mere child, his father gave him a lyre and taught him to play upon it. But Orpheus needed very little instructions, for soon as he laid his hand upon the strings, the wild beasts crept out of their lairs to crouch beside him. The trees at the mountainside moved nearer so they may listen, and the flowers, they sprung up in clusters around him, unwilling to remain any longer asleep in that cold earth. When Orpheus sought in marriage the golden-haired Eurydice, there were other suitors for her hand, but though they brought rich gifts gathered out of many distant lands, they could not win the love of the maiden, and she turned from them to bestow her hand upon Orpheus, who had no way to woo her but with his sweet music. On the wedding day there was the usual mirth and feasting, but one event occurred that cast a gloom over the happiness of the newly married pair. When Hymen, god of marriage, came with his torch to bless the nuptial feast, the light that should have burned clear and pure began to smoke ominously, as if predicting a future disaster. And the evil omen was fulfilled all too soon, for one day when Eurydice was walking in the meadow, she met the youth Aristeus, who was so charmed with her beauty that he insisted upon staying beside her to pour his ardent speeches into her unwilling ears. To escape from these troublesome attentions, Eurydice started to run away, and as she ran, she trotted upon a poisonous snake, which quickly turned and bit her. She had barely time to reach home before the poison had done its work, and Orpheus heard the sad story from her quivering, dying lips. As soon as Mercury had led away the soul of Eurydice, the bereaved husband hastened to the shining halls of Olympus, and throwing himself down before the golden throne of Jupiter, he implored the great ruler of the gods and men to give him back his wife. There was always pity in the hearts of the gods for those who die in flowering times. So Jupiter gave permission to Orpheus to go down into Hades and beg of Pluto the wish that he craved. It was a steep and a perilous journey to the kingdom of the dead, and the road was one that no mortal had ever trod upon. But through his love for Eurydice, Orpheus forgot all the dangers of the way, and when he spoke her name, the terrors of the darkness vanished. In his hand he held his lyre, and when he arrived at the gate of Hades, there were the fierce three-headed dog Cerberus, who refused to let him pass. Orpheus stood still in the uncertain darkness and began to play his lyre. As he plucked the strings, the snarling of the dog ceased, and the noise of its harsh breath began to grow faint. Then Orpheus went on his way, quite undisturbed, but he still played softly on his lyre, and the sounds floated far into the dismal interior of Hades, where the souls of the condemned labour forever at their tasks. Tantalus heard the music, and ceased to strive for a drop of the forbidden water. Ixion rested a moment beside his ever-revolving wheel, and Sisyphus stood listening, while the rock which he must roll through all eternity fell from his wearied arms. The daughters of Danaos laid down their urns beside the sieve, into which they were forever pouring water, and as the mournful wailing of Orpheus's lyre told the story of his lost love, they wept then for a sorrow not of their own. So plaintive indeed was the music, that all the shadowy forms that flitted endlessly by shed tears of sympathy for the player's grief. Even the cheeks of the Furies were wet with tears. When Orpheus came before the throne of Pluto, that relentless monarch repulsed him angrily as he attempted to plead his cause, and commanded him to depart. Then the son of Apollo began to play upon his lyre, and though his music told the story of his loss, he besought the ruler of these myriad souls to give him the single one that he craved. So wonderfully did he play that the hard, cold heart of Pluto was touched with pity, and he consented to restore Eurydice to her husband, on condition that as they went out together from the loathed country of the dead, he should not once turn his head to look upon her. This strange decree Orpheus gladly promised obedience. So Eurydice was summoned from among the million shadow shapes that throng the silent halls of death. Pluto told her the condition on which her freedom was to be won, and then bade her to follow her husband. During all the wearisome journey back to the earth, Orpheus never forgot the promise he had made, though he often longed to give just a hurried glance at the face of Eurydice, to see whether it had finally lost its sadness. As they neared the spot where the first faint glimmerings of light filtered down into the impenetrable darkness, Orpheus thought he had heard his wife calling, and he quickly looked round to find whether she was still following him. At that very moment, the slight form close behind him began to fade away, and a mournful voice, seemingly far in the distance, called out to him a sad farewell. He knew that no second chance would be given to him to win his wife from the hold of Pluto, even if he could again charm the three-headed Cerberus, or even persuade Charon, the grim ferryman, to take him across the river. So he went forlornly back to the earth, and lived in a forest cave far from the companionship of men. At first there was only his lyre to share his solitude, but soon the creatures of the forest came to live beside him, and often sat listening to his music, looking exceedingly wise and exceedingly sorrowful. Even in his sleepless hours, when he fancied he heard his dear Eurydice calling, he was never quite alone, for the bat and the owl and the things that love the darkness of night flitted about him, and he saw the glow-worms creep toward him out of the cold night grass. One day, a party of bacchantes found him seated outside the cave, playing the mournful music that told of his lost love, and they bade him change the sad notes to something cheerful so that they may dance. But Orpheus was far too wrapped up in his sorrow to play any strain of cheerful music, and he refused to do as they asked. The Bacchantes were half maddened by their festival days of drinking, and this refusal so engaged them that they fell upon the luckless musician, and they tore him to pieces. Then they threw his mangled body into the river, and as the head of Orpheus drifted down the stream, his lips murmured again and again, Eurydice, until the hills echoed that beloved name, and the rocks and trees and rivers repeated it in mournful chorus. Later on, the Muses gathered up his remains to give them honourable burial, and it is said that over Orpheus's grave the nightingale sings more sweetly than in any other spot in Greece. The children of Jupiter. The three children of Jupiter and Juno were Hebe, Mars, and Vulcan. Hebe, the goddess of youth, was the cupbearer at feasts of Olympus, and poured from the golden flagons the sparkling ruby-tinted nectar. Many times were the brimming cups emptied and filled again, for the gods loved long draughts of life-giving nectar that kept off all sickness and decay. No wine of earth's yielding ever appeared at these royal banquets, nor were there ever seen here the heaped-up platters of food such as the mortals crave. For the gods only ate of the divine ambrosia, which ensured them eternal youth and beauty. For so long a time had fair-haired Hebe served at the feasts of Olympus, that the gods never thought that she could be deprived of her office. But once, as she was handing Jupiter a well-filled cup, she stumbled and fell, and the ruler of gods and men was so angry that she should never be again the cupbearer. Since no one among the gods was willing to fill this humble position, Jupiter was obliged to seek all over the earth for some mortal to take the place of the poor disgraced Hebe. To make the journey as speedily as possible, he assumed the form of an eagle, and spent many days soaring over the land before he found the youth whose slender grace made him feel assured that its possessor would be able to serve the gods less awkwardly than Hebe. On the sunny slopes of Mount Ida, he saw a group of youths playing games, and among them was one who Jupiter determined to bear away at once to Olympus. This was Ganymede, a prince of Troy, and the fact that he was no common mortal, but a king's son, did not deter Jupiter from swooping down upon the astonished youth and carrying him aloft on his wings. Whether Ganymede was happy in Olympus, we don't know, but the story does go that he remained forever at Jupiter's side, and the city of Troy never saw him again, nor did the king, his father, ever know the reason for his strange disappearance. Mars. Mars was the god of war, and though he was the least loved of all the deities in Olympus, he was also the one most feared by every people of every land, as he was always a hater of peace, and would stir up strife among men for the mere delight of fighting and bloodshed. The poet Homer calls him the slayer of men, one steeped in blood, the destroyer of walled towns. His shrines were neither wreathed with flowers, nor were children often found among the people grouped about his altars. Instead of the yearling ox with gilded horns, men sacrificed a savage bull to the god, who took no pleasure in the tame shedding of blood. Sometimes Bellona, the goddess of war, accompanied Mars in his chariot to watch over his safety, and since she was equally eager to urge men on to bloody fighting, their appearance together on the battlefield brought terror to even the bravest of hearts. Seldom were prayers addressed to these two deities, except those of vengeance upon enemies, and there was little hope of peace for the nation when men thronged the temples where Mars and Bellona were jointly worshipped. The fiercest passions were kindled at their shrines, and their altars were the only ones that were ever defiled by human sacrifices. Though so fierce in warfare, Mars was as susceptible to love as were all the immortals, for he was not only the chosen one of golden-haired Venus, but also the devoted lover of the Vestal Rhea Silvia. This maiden, being dedicated to the goddess Vesta, did not dare to listen to any words of love until her time of service in the temple was over, for the penalty of breaking her solemn vows would be the terrible one of buried alive. But Mars was simply not to be denied, so at last the Vestal yielded, but kept her marriage secret, and continued to live in the temple until the birth of her twin sons, Romulus and Remus. When her parents learned that she had failed to keep the sacred promise at the altar fire of Vesta, they demanded that she suffer the prescribed punishment. She was therefore taken at night into an underground room of the temple and enclosed in the wall which had been built to allow for just such a tragic event. As her children were declared outcasts, they were taken into the forest and left to perish by the teeth of the wild beasts. Romulus and Remus did not die, however, for a she-wolf carried them to her lair and reared them with her own cubs. Later on they were found by a kindly shepherd, who took care of them until they grew to manhood, and then they left him and went out into the world to seek adventures, which soon ended in Romulus killing his brother Remus and becoming the founder of Rome. When this new city was established, Mars was made its patron deity and protector, and before an army set out on military campaign, the leader would first go into the temple and pray with a sacred shield the ancile hung, and touching it fearfully would say the words, "O Mars, watch over us." This shield was carefully guarded in Rome, for upon it depended the safety of the city. It was a special token sent by the god of war to show that the people of Rome were under his specific protection, for once a plague was raging among them, and the dead were numbered in the thousands. The Romans fled to the temple of Mars and begged him to help them. As they were praying, the shield fell from the skies into their midst, and a voice told them that as long as this, the sacred ancile, was with them, no harm could come to Rome. That very day the plague ceased, and ever afterwards the shield was jealously guarded. To ensure its safety, 11 other shields were made, so like the ancillae that no one but the Salii, the priests of the temple, knew which it was. These were carried in the streets during the festivals in honor of Mars, which were held in March, the month that bears his name. And as priests bore aloft the shields, they sang songs of war and performed dances. Sometimes the shields were displayed on the broad grounds where the soldiers and youths of the city held their exercises. This place was dedicated to the god of war, and was called the Campus Martius, or the Field of Mars. During the war between the gods and the giants, Mars was eager to prove his skill in warfare, that he engaged in a fierce battle with Otus and Ephialtes. These two giants were only 9 years old, but they were already of immense size, and they increased in height at the rate of 9 inches every single month. The young giants were very proud of having conquered the god of war, and carried him off the battlefield in triumph. They bound Mars with iron chains, and kept a careful guard over him, so that none of the gods would be able to set him free. Whenever Mars attempted to escape at night, believing that the giants were asleep, the rattle of the chains woke his guardians, and all hope of rescuing him was over. In this disgraceful bondage, the unhappy Mars lingered for 15 months, until Mercury, the Prince of Thieves, unfastened the chains and restored him to freedom. When Cadmus went on his search for his sister Europa, whom Jupiter, in the form of a white bull, had carried off to a distant land, the devoted brother was at last bidden to give up his hopeless quest, to settle in the country later called Boeotia, and to found a city there. Cadmus was glad to rest after his long march, and he sent some of his men in search of a spring. When they did not come back, he sent others to look for them, and when these did not return, he went himself to see what had caused all this delay. He carried his sword in his hand, and also a long spear, for he guessed that some disaster had overtaken his men. He wandered some time before he discovered any trace of them, and then at the edge of a forest he came upon the lifeless body of one of those who had first set out to find the spring. As he went farther into the forest, he found the others, all of them lifeless, and soon he came to a large cave, at the entrance of which bubbled a fountain of the purest water. Not knowing that this was a grove sacred to Mars, and a fountain that had never been polluted by mortal touch, Cadmus stopped to drink, when suddenly out of the deep shadows of the cave rushed a huge dragon with crested head and glittering scales, and a triple tongue vibrating between triple rows of teeth. This monster, twisting his body into a huge coil, darted towards Cadmus with gleaming fangs. But the young prince dealt his assailant a terrific blow that pierced the dragon in a vital spot, and it rolled over, dead upon the floor of the cold cave. Then Cadmus heard a voice telling him to take out the dragon's teeth and sow them into the ground where he wished to build his future city of Thebes. As soon as the teeth were sown, a crop of giants in glittering armor sprung up out of the ground. And when they were about to turn their spears upon Cadmus, he again heard the voice, this time bidding him to throw a stone into the midst of the armed men. This caused a terrific battle to begin among the giants themselves, and soon they were all killed, except 5 who laid down their weapons and offered their services to Cadmus. As a punishment for the desecration of his grove and the slaying of its sacred guardian, Mars compelled Cadmus to serve him for 8 years. At the end of his time, the prince was made ruler of the new city of Thebes, and Mars so far forgave the sacrilege of his grove as to Cadmus his daughter Harmonia in marriage. The career of the new king was very prosperous at first, and Cadmus was supposed to have contributed a great boon to his people by the invention of the alphabet. Later on, he incurred the wrath of the gods by forgetting to offer them suitable sacrifices, and both he and his wife Harmonia were turned into serpents. Just above the city of Athens was a hill called the Areopagus, from the Greek word meaning Mars Hill, which received its name from a famous trial that took place there. Neptune's son had carried off the daughter of Mars, and when the god of war learned of the abduction, he hurried after the daring youth and struck him down. Then Neptune demanded that Mars should be punished for his deed of blood, and to decide the matter, both were summoned to appear before the court of justice, which was held on the hill above Athens. As it was the custom for all important cases to be tried at night, so that the judges might not be prejudiced by the favorable appearance of either party, the court assembled in the darkness, and Mars told the story of his daughter's capture and his own subsequent revenge. In spite of Neptune's objections to what he considered an unfair verdict, the judges decided in favor of Mars, and he was therefore acquitted. The hill was afterwards called by his name, and the judges of the principal court of justice were always termed Areopagite. Vulcan. Vulcan, god of fire and the forge, was not often seen in the halls of Olympus, for he knew that the gods despised him for his ungainly appearance, and he preferred to stay in his own sooty workshop. He had also no desire for the society of his divine parents, since his mother had never shown anything but indifference towards him, but his father had been the cause of his deformity. Jupiter was once so angry with Juno for interfering in his love affairs that he fastened her to the end of a strong chain and hung her out of heaven. Vulcan, seeing his mother in this sad plight, dragged at the chain, and finally succeeding in drawing Juno into safety. Full of wrath at defiance of his wishes, Jupiter kicked his son out of heaven, and, as the distance of the fall was so great, it was a whole day and night before Vulcan reached the earth. Had he been immortal, there would be nothing left to tell of the story of his meteor-like descent. But being a god, he still lived, and had only a slight deformity and lameness as the result of the fall. When he learned that Juno was so unconcerned over his fate that she had never even inquired whether he was badly hurt, he promised to never go back to Olympus, but shut himself away in the heart of Mount Etna, where he established a mighty forge that poured out fire and smoke for many years after. Vulcan did not forget about his mother's heartless indifference, but none of the gods suspected him of harboring any revenge, until one day a beautiful golden throne arrived in Olympus as a present to Juno from her son. The goddess admired the exquisite designs carved on its polished surface, and seated herself in it proudly. Now, Vulcan had contrived to hide some springs in the interior of the throne, and these were so skillfully arranged that at the moment a person was seated, the entire structure quickly contracted and held the occupant prisoner. So in a moment, proud Juno found herself securely caught, and no assistance that the gods could render was the least of avail. Then Jupiter sent Mercury to the grimy abode of Vulcan to beg, politely, that the god of fire would honor with his presence the feast that was held that day in Mount Olympus. But Vulcan was not to be moved by any flattery, for he knew all too well why he was so much desired at this particular time. So Mercury returned alone to Olympus, and Jupiter was obliged to think of some other way of luring Vulcan from his forge. This time he sent Bacchus, the god of wine, and when the scowling deity of Etna saw Bacchus's jolly red face and heard his hearty laugh, he welcomed the jovial visitor, and drank freely of the wine that Bacchus provided. The roisterous god of revels, who dearly loved to see the good wine flowing, beguiled Vulcan into taking draught after draught of the choice vintage that he had purposely brought, until the sullen master of the forge was quite unable to tell what was happening, and allowed himself to be led unresistingly to Olympus. Once there, the gods persuaded him to release the repentant Juno, and to allow himself to be reinstated in the favor of Jupiter. Though Vulcan grudgingly complied with these requests, he would not consent to live in Olympus, but returned to his workshop in Mount Etna. There he made many things out of gold and precious stones, and gave them to the gods as evidence that he no longer bore them any ill will. Their golden thrones were made by Vulcan's crafty hands, and the wonderful palaces, with all their beautiful and costly furnishings, were the best result of his skill. He also forged Jupiter's thunderbolts, and fashioned the weapons that the gods used in battle. He made Apollo's marvelous sun chariot, and even designed to use his skill in shaping the arrows that Cupid used in his golden bow. When Jupiter decreed that laughter-loving Venus should wed his misshapen son, Vulcan took his reluctant wife to the smoky workshop in Mount Etna, and for a while Venus was amused at the unusual sights and sounds that greeted her in her new home, but she soon wearied of the dirt and the darkness, and left the society of her surly husband to return to Olympus, where there was plenty to delight her pleasure-loving soul. The story of Prosperina. When Jupiter made himself ruler of the world, He imprisoned some of the warring giants beneath Mount Etna in Sicily, much to the disgust of Pluto, who was always fearing that when the giants got restless and turned over and over underground, thus causing earthquakes, they would someday make such a large crack in the earth that daylight would be let into Hades. So Pluto often went up out of his sunless land to look carefully over the island, and to be sure that no new fissure was being made in the earth's surface. One day, as he was driving his 4 coal black horses through the vale of Enna, he saw a group of maidens gathering violets on the hillside, and among them was one so exquisitely fair that Pluto determined to take her for his wife. This was Prosperina, the daughter of Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, a maiden who had ever shunned the thought of marriage and preferred to spend her life playing games and dancing in the beautiful plain of Enna, where there is never any frost or snow, but springtime lasts throughout the year. Pluto had often tried to gain a wife by gentle means, but no one would consent to share his gruesome home. So, knowing that his maiden he desired would never listen to soft words of love, he determined to take her by force. Driving his fiery horses at full speed, he rushed toward the group of laughing girls who scattered and fled at his approach. Prosperina alone stood still and stared, frightened and wondering, at the grim figure confronting her, while the flowers she had gathered dropped from her trembling hands. In a moment, Pluto seized her in his strong arms, trampling all her violets under his ruthless feet. He sprung into the chariot and urged his horses to their full speed, hoping to reach Hades before the maiden's cries brought Ceres to the rescue. As he neared the Cyan River, the waters, wishing to befriend Prosperina, began to rise higher and higher, and with tossing waves opposed the madly rushing steeds. Fearing to risk the chariot in the angry waters, Pluto struck the ground with his terrible 2-pronged fork, and a great chasm opened before him, into which the ruler of Hades hurriedly plunged. The earth closed again over him, and the captured maiden. And during the dreadful moments when Prosperina held a prisoner in the arms of this bold wooer, she called wildly to her mother for help. But soon she realized her cries would never reach the ears of Ceres, and that she must find another way to let the goddess know of her cruel fate. So she summoned enough strength to struggle in her captor's embrace until she freed one arm from his hold, and with it loosened her girdle, which she flung into the Cyan River just before the yawning earth hid her so completely that no traces were left to tell where she had gone. When Ceres came that evening into the vale of Enna and found that her daughter was not playing as usual with the other maidens, she questioned them, and learned their tearful story of the chariot with its 4 black horses and terrible driver. Just what had become of Prosperina, no one could tell her. So the distracted and hopeless mother began her search, not knowing whether she might at any moment come upon her daughter's body mangled by the chariot wheels. For days she wandered, never stopping to rest, except for a few hours at night when it was too dark for her to see the way. Rosy-fingered Aurora when she left her soft couch to open the gates of the morning, and Hesperus, when he let out the stars of the evening, saw her still searching for the lost Prosperina. Sometimes she was so weary that she sank down by the roadside and let the night dew drench her aching limbs. Sometimes she rested under the trees when a storm broke over her head, but even here the rain beat down upon her and the wind blew its cold breath on her face. Kindly people gave her food whenever she stopped to ask for it, and though none thought or knew that she was a goddess, they sympathized with her grief when she told them that she was seeking her lost child. It was only once that she met with unkindness. She was sitting at a cottage door, eating gruel from a bowl, and a lad, Stellio by name, laughed insolently at her enjoyment of the meal. To punish him for his rudeness, the goddess threw some of the gruel in his face, and immediately he was changed into the form of a lizard. One day, Ceres found herself near the city of Eleusis, and to avoid being recognized as a goddess, she disguised herself as an old beggar woman. She sat for a long time on a stone by the roadside, mourning her lost Prosperina, until a little girl came by, driving some goats. Seeing the old woman's tearful face, the child stopped to ask her trouble. But before Ceres could answer, the girl's father joined her, and together they begged the stranger to come to their cottage and rest. The goddess at last yielded to their kindly insistence, and she walked beside the old man, whose name was Celeus. He told her that at home he had a sick boy who had lately grown so ill that today they believed he would surely pass away. Ceres listened to his pathetic story, and for a moment forgot her own grief. Seeing a chance to return the old man's kindness, she followed him into the cottage, but first stopped by the meadow to gather a handful of poppies. When the parents led her to the sick child's bedside, she stooped and kissed the pale little face, and immediately it became rosy with health. The boy sprung up, well and strong again, to the great astonishment of the delighted family. As they sat at the simple evening meal, the goddess put some poppy juice in the glass of milk set out for the boy, and that night, when he was in heavy sleep, she rubbed his body with oil, murmured over him a solemn charm, and was about to lay him on the red-hot ashes in the fire, that his mortal parts might be consumed, and he himself be made immortal, when his mother chanced to enter the room, and springing forward with a cry of horror, snatched the boy from the fire. Before the excited mother could vent her wrath upon the old woman, Ceres assumed her goddess form and quietly reproved the intruder, for her interference had not averted a harm, but had prevented a great gift from being conferred upon the unconscious child. When Ceres left the cottage of Celeus, she continued her wanderings over the earth, and finally returned, discouraged and heartbroken, to Sicily. Chancing to be near the river Cyane, she went down to the water's edge to drink, and happily discovered the girdle that Prosperina had dropped there in her flight. This made her hopeful for finding further traces of her lost daughter, so she lingered by the river bank, eagerly scanning the overflowing stream. As she stood there, holding the recovered girdle in her hand, she heard a low murmuring sound, as if someone were speaking in whispers. The goddess listened, wondering from what place the voice came, and soon she found that the soft tones proceeded from a fountain, which was so close to her that its lightly tossed spray fell on her hand. The murmur was often indistinct, but Ceres understood enough to realize that the words were addressed to her, and that the fountain was trying to tell her how Pluto had come up from Hades and carried off Prosperina to be his wife. While the goddess was musing over this painful revelation, the fountain went on to say that it had not always been a stream in sunny Sicily, but was once a maiden named Arethusa, and a native of the country of Elis. As a follower of Diana, she had roamed in the wooded hills, and one day, being wearied from the chase, she sought refreshment in this forest stream. The drooping willows hung protectingly over the water, and here the nymph bathed fearlessly, believing herself to be alone. But Alpheus, the river god, heard the splashing of the water, and rose from his grassy bed to see who was disturbing his noonday rest. At the sight of Arethusa, he was so delighted that he ventured to approach her. But she fled, terrified through the forest, calling on Diana for help. The goddess, hearing her cries, changed her into a fountain, and to further baffle the pursuing Alpheus, she wrapped it in a thick mist. As the river god could no longer see the nymph, he was about to give up the chase, when Zephyrus maliciously blew away the cloud, and Alpheus saw the bubbling fountain. Suspecting that it was Arethusa, the god changed himself into a rushing torrent, and was preparing to mingle his impetuous waves with the waters of the fountain when the nymph called out again to Diana to protect her. The goddess came to her rescue by opening up a crevice in the earth, and here the shivering waters of the fountain found a speedy refuge. To keep far out of the reach of Alpheus, it continued to flow underground for many miles and even crept beneath the sea, until it reached Sicily, where Diana again cleft the earth and allowed the fountain to come up into the sunlight. During her journey through the dark underworld, Arethusa said that she had seen Prosperina sitting, tearful and sad, on a throne beside the grim ruler of the dead. When she heard this story, Ceres was no longer in doubt about where her lost daughter could be found, but the knowledge gave her little comfort, for she was aware how useless it would be to ask Pluto to give up the wife that he so daringly won. Seeing no hope of gaining her child back, Ceres retired to a cave in the hills, and paid no heed to the waiting earth that had suffered so long from her neglect. There was drought in the land, and the crops were failing for want of water. The fruit trees were drying up, and the flowers were withering on the parched hillsides. Everything cried out for the protection care of Ceres, but the goddess stayed her hand, and in the solitude of the cave mourned unceasingly for Prosperina. famine spread over the land. But the people, in spite of their dire need for food, burned sacrifices of sheep and oxen on the altars of Ceres, where they importuned her with their prayers. Jupiter heard their cries, and besought the goddess to take the earth again under her wise care, but she refused to listen, for she was indifferent now to the welfare of men, and no longer delighted in the ripening harvest. When sickness and death followed hard upon famine, Jupiter saw that he must save the sorely stricken land. So he promised the goddess that her daughter should be restored to her if she had eaten nothing during all her sojourn in Pluto's realm. Mercury was sent to lead Prosperina out of Hades, but when reaching there, he found that Pluto had already given his wife some pomegranate seeds, hoping she would thereby stay forever in his keeping. Dismayed at the unexpected downfall of their hopes, Ceres was about to shut herself up again in the cave, when Jupiter, in behalf of the suffering earth, made a compromise with Pluto, whereby Prosperina was to spend half her time with her mother in the land of sunshine and flowers, and the rest with her husband in the cold and cheerless Hades. Each spring, Mercury was sent to lead Prosperina up from the underworld, lest her eyes, grown accustomed only to shadows, be dazzled by the blinding sunlight, and she herself should lose the way. All things awaited her coming, and as soon as her foot touched the winter-saddened earth, the flowers bloomed to delight her eyes. The grass sprung up to carpet her way with greenness, the birds sang to cheer her long-depressed spirit, and above her the sun shone brilliantly in the blue sky of Sicily. Ceres no longer mourned, nor did she again suffer a great famine to afflict the land. The patient old earth smiled again on Prosperina's return, for then her mother gave the blighted vegetation a redoubled care. But her happiness could not make the goddess forget the kindly old man who had given her food and shelter at Eleusis, for she returned there and taught the boy Triptolemus all the secrets of agriculture. She also gave him her chariot, and bade him journey everywhere, teaching the people how to plough and sow and reap, and care for their harvests. Triptolemus carried out all her instructions, and he travelled all over the country, eagerly welcomed alike by prince and peasant, until he came to Scythia, where the cruel king Lincus would have killed him in a fit of jealous wrath, had not Ceres interfered with timely aid, and changed the treacherous king into a lynx. Pluto and the Underworld. In the beginning of the world, before the gods came to dwell in Olympus, all the universe was in the hands of the Titans, and among these the greatest was Saturn, or Kronos, who wedded his sister Rhea, also called Cybele, and became the father of 3 sons and 3 daughters: Jupiter, Pluto, Neptune, Ceres, Vesta, and Juno. For many ages, Saturn and Rhea, having subdued all the opposing Titans, ruled over heaven and earth. But when the cruelty of Saturn drove his children into rebellion, there arose a mighty war in the universe, in which the sons and daughters of Saturn leagued against their father, who had called upon the other Titans for aid. After years of combat, the 6 brothers and sisters, helped by the Cyclops, defeated the allied Titans and imprisoned them in the black abyss of Tartarus. All except a few who had chosen not to join in the war against the children of Saturn. Among these who were wise enough to accept the new sovereignty were Mnemosyne and Themis, the goddess of justice. Those descendants of the Titans who refused to acknowledge the supremacy of Jupiter were consigned to the center of Mount Etna, and were the giants who constantly turned over and over, making Pluto fear for the safety of his realm. A few of the giants were spared. Atlas, whose punishment was to hold the heavens upon his shoulders, and Prometheus and Epimetheus, who had espoused the cause of Jupiter and so escaped the fate of the conquered Titans. When the children of Saturn found themselves masters of the world, they agreed to accept Jupiter as their ruler, on the condition that the 2 other brothers would be given a share in the universe. So, a division was made whereby Pluto became the king of the Underworld, or Hades. Neptune took the dominion of the sea, and Jupiter, having married his sister Juno, established his dwelling in Olympus as the Lord of heaven and earth. The kingdom of Pluto was dreaded by all mortals, and its ruler inspired men with great fear. Though Pluto was known to visit the earth from time to time, there was no one who wished to see his face, and each man dreaded the moment when he should be obliged to appear before the grim monarch of Hades, and be assigned a place among the innumerable dead. There were no temples dedicated to Pluto, though altars were sometimes erected on which men burned sacrifices to this inexorable god, while petitioning him to be merciful to the souls of the departed. The festivals held in his honor were celebrated only once 100 years, and on these occasions none but black animals were killed for the sacrifice. The Underworld, over which Pluto reigned, was deep in the heart of the earth, but there were several entrances to it, one being near Lake Avernus, where the mist rising from the waters was so foul that not a single bird could bear to fly over it. The lake itself was in an extinct volcano near Vesuvius. It was very deep, and was surrounded by high banks covered with a thick forest. The first descent into Hades could be easily accomplished, but no mortal was daring enough to venture far into the blackest depths, lest he should never see again the light of day. At the portals of Hades sits the fierce 3-headed dog known as Cerberus, who keeps all living things from entering the gate and allows no spirit that has at once been admitted to pass out again. From here a long dark pathway leads deeper into Hades, and is finally lost in the rivers that flow around Pluto's throne. The waters of the Cocytus are salt, as they are made of the tears that stream forever from the eyes of those unhappy souls, making a river, those who are condemned to labor in Tartarus, that part of Hades that is exclusively the abode of the wicked. The Phlegethon River, which is always on fire, separates Tartarus from the rest of Hades, and wretched indeed is the soul that is forced to cross its seething waters. on the banks of the Acheron, a black and turbid river, stand the souls who come fresh from the sunlit earth. For all must pass this river and be brought before the judgment throne of Pluto. There is no bridge over the murky stream, and the current is so swift that the boldest swimmer would not trust himself to its treacherous waters. The only way to cross is by the leaky, worm-eaten boat rowed by Charon, an aged ferryman who has plied his oar ever since the day that curse of death first came upon the earth. No spirit is allowed to enter the leaky craft until he has first paid Charon the small fee of coin called the obolus. During the funeral services, before the body is committed for burial, this coin is laid on the tongue of the dead, that the soul may have no trouble in passing into the throne of Pluto. If any spirit cannot furnish the necessary money, they are ruthlessly pushed aside by the mercenary boatmen and are required to wait for 100 years. At the end of this time, Charon grudgingly ferries them over the river free of charge. As the unstable boat can hold but a few, there is always an eager group of spirits on the further bank, clamoring to be taken across the river. But Charon is never in a hurry, and repulses, sometimes with his oar, the pitiful crowd that awaits his grim pleasure. There is also in Hades the river Styx, by whose sacred waters the gods swear the most terrible of all oaths, and on the other side of Pluto's throne is the softly flowing Lethe, of which only those souls can drink who are to spend endless days of happiness in the Elysian fields. As soon as those blessed spirits have tasted the waters of Lethe, all regrets for friends that mourn completely vanish, and the joy and grief and pleasure and pain of the soul's life on earth are all but forgotten. In the Elysian fields, there is no darkness such as fills the rest of Hades with its thick gloom, but a soft light spreads over the meadows where the spirits of the thrice-blessed wanderer. There are willows here, and stately silver poplars, and the meads of asphodel breathe out a faint perfume from their pale flowers. There do men lead easiest lives. No snow, no bitter cold, no beating rains are there. The sighs and groans that rise by day and night from the black abyss of Tartarus do not reach the ears of those who dwell at peace in the Elysian fields, and the sight of its painful torments is hid forever from their eyes. Beside Pluto's throne sit the three Fates, whose deathless sisters hold the threads of life and death in their hands. Clotho, the youngest, spins the thread. Lachesis, the second, twines into it the joys and sorrows, hopes and fears that make up the human experience. And the eldest sister, Anthropos, sits by with huge shears in her hand, waiting for the time when she may cut the slender thread. Pluto and his queen Prosperina are seated side by side on a sable throne, ruling over the myriad souls that compose the vast kingdom of the dead. Perched on the back of the throne is the blinking owl, who loves this eternal darkness, and the black-winged raven that was once a bird of snowy plumage and the favorite messenger of Apollo. The raven fell from his high estate on account of some unwelcome tidings that he had once brought to Apollo, when that god was an ardent lover of the fair-headed Coronis. Believing that no one could supplant him in the maiden's affections, Apollo was happy in the thought of being beloved by so beautiful a mortal. But one day his snow-white raven flew in haste to Olympus to tell him that the maiden was listening to the wooing of another. Enraged at this duplicity, Apollo seized his bow, and he shot the faithless Coronis. But the moment that he saw her lying dead, he repented of his rash deed, and vainly sought to restore her to life. Though skilled in the art of healing, Apollo could not save the maiden, and in his frenzied grief he cursed the unfortunate raven that had brought the evil tidings, and banished it forever from his sight. Near Pluto's throne are seated the three judges of Hades, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, who question all souls that are brought across the river. When they have learned every detail of the newcomer's past life, they deliver the cowering spirit into the hands of Deimos, the blindfolded goddess of justice, who weighs impartially the good and bad deeds in her unerring scales. If the good outweighs the evil, the soul is led gently to the Elysian fields. But if the bad overbalances the good, then the wretched spirit is driven to Tartarus, there to suffer for all its wrongdoings in the fires that burn forever and ever behind the brazen gates. To these gates the guilty one is urged by the three Furies, whose snaky hair shakes hideously as they ply their lashes to goad the shrinking soul to its place of torment. Sometimes they are joined by Nemesis, the goddess of revenge, who hurries the doomed spirit over the fiery waters of the Phlegethon with her merciless whip, and sees that it follows no path but the one leading to the brazen gates of Tartarus. As soon as the gates close on the newly admitted soul, there is a renewed clamor of voices, while heart-breaking sighs and groans mingle with the curses of those who in their misery dare to defy the gods. And beneath all the awful sounds that greet the listener's ear, there is an undertone of pitiful wailing, like the sea's melancholy, long-withdrawing roar, that seems to come from millions of throats too feeble to utter a loud cry. The deepest sighs proceed from Danaïdes, the beautiful daughters of Danaus, the king of Argos, who must forever strive to fill a bottomless cask with water. They form a sad procession, as with their urns in their arms they go down to the stream to begin their hopeless task, and then climb up wearily the steep bank to pour the water into the ever-empty cask. If they pause a moment, exhausted with fatigue, the whips of some avenging attendants of Pluto lash them again into action. Their punishment is severe, but the crime for which they are suffering was a dreadful one indeed. You see, the 50 daughters of Danaus were once pledged in marriage to the 50 sons of Aegyptus, the brother of Danaus. But then, when the wedding was to be celebrated, their father remembered the words of an ancient prophecy that said he would die by the hand of his son-in-law. Fearing for his life, he confided to his daughters what the oracle had foretold, and gave them each a dagger, bidding them to slay their husbands. On the evening of the wedding, when the sons of Aegyptus were heavy with wine, the new-made wives stole upon them and killed them all as they slept. Danaeus then believed himself to be safe, until he learned that one of his daughters had spared her husband out of the love she had for him. This son-in-law was eager to avenge the murders of his brothers, and having sought out the wicked Danaeus, fulfilled the prophecy by killing the king with the very dagger that was intended for his own death. The gods punished the cruel daughters, except for Hypernestra, whom had saved her husband. The rest were condemned to labor in Tartarus, their impossible tasks forever. Near the Danaides stands Tantalus, the father of Niobe, who on earth was a most human and brutal king. He ill-treated his subjects, defied the gods, and even dared to make his own will the religion of the entire kingdom. He boasted that the gods were not so omniscient as people were led to believe, and insulted the immortals by offering them at a banquet of flesh of his own son Pelops, believing they would never learn the truth of this loathsome feast. But the gods, they are not so easily deceived, and left the meal untouched, all except poor Ceres, who, still mourning over her daughter's detention in Hades, did not realize what was happening, and bit off some of the lad's shoulder. When the gods restored Pelops to life, Ceres was very sorry for her carelessness, and gave him a shoulder of ivory. The inhuman Tantalus was condemned to the torments of Tartarus, where he stands up to his chin in a clear stream. Though frenzied with thirst, he can never drink of the water, for whenever he bends his head, the stream recedes from his lips. Above him hangs a branch of delicious fruit, but when, tormented with hunger, he strives to grasp it, the branch eludes his eager fingers. Thus he stays, always tantalized by the sight of food and drink, which he can never secure. Not far from Tantalus is Salmoneus, also a king, who dared to challenge the gods by impersonating Jupiter. He made a huge bridge of brass and drove heavily over it while he threw lighted torches among the people who were waiting below, hoping thus to frighten them into believing that he was the very ruler of the heavens who hurls the mighty thunderbolts. This insult to his divinity so angered Jupiter that he seized a real thunderbolt and soon dispatched with the arrogant king. When Salmoneus came before the throne of Pluto, his fate was quickly decided, and he was driven to terrible Tartarus, where he sits under a huge rock that threatens every moment to fall and crush him beneath its weight. Another unhappy king is Sisyphus, who, when ruler of Corinth, became a famous robber, and in the pride of his great wealth dared to set the gods at naught. Therefore he was consigned to Tartarus, and his punishment is to roll an immense stone to the top of a steep hill. But as soon as he reaches the summit, the rock slips from his aching arms and tumbles to the foot of the hill, and he must once start on the hopeless task of pushing it up the long ascent once more. With many a weary step and many a groan, up the high hill he heaves the huge round stone. Beyond Sisyphus lies Tityos, a giant whose body covers 9 acres of ground. He was condemned to the blackness of Tartarus because he dared to affront a goddess with his address, and so was doomed to suffer like Prometheus, being chained to a rock while a vulture tears at his liver. Near him is Ixion, who was promised the hand of a certain maiden in marriage on condition that he would give her father a large sum of money. Ixion agreed, but when the maiden became his wife, he refused to give the stipulated sum, in spite of her father's clamorous demands. At length, wearied by the old man's insistence, Ixion slew him. But the deed did not go unpunished, for the gods summoned him to appear before them and answer for this cruelty. Ixion pleaded his cause so well that Jupiter was about to dismiss him, when he saw the presumptuous mortal making love to Juno. This offense could not be overlooked, and so Ixion was sent to Tartarus, where he was bound to an ever-revolving wheel of fire. If anyone could follow the course of the gentle Lethe River, it would lead beyond the sunless realm of Pluto to a quiet and far-distant valley, where in a soundless cave lives Somnus, the god of sleep, and his twin brother Mors, the god of death. Here the sun, whether rising or in his mid-course or setting, can never come, and fogs mingled with the dimness form a strange twilight. No wakeful bird calls forth the morn, nor do watchful dogs disturb the brooding silence. No sound of wild beast or cattle, nor any noise of creaking bough nor human voice breaks in upon the perfect stillness, where mute rest has her abode. Before the cave bloom abundant poppies and other sleep-producing herbs, which night gathers that she may distill their juice and scatter slumbers on the darkened earth. Within the cave is no door that could creak on rusty hinge, and no porter stands at the entrance of that inner room, where on a downy couch made of black ebony and draped with sable curtains, over which black plumes wave, lies Somnus, the god of sleep. Ah, sleep, the repose of all things, the gentlest of the deities, whom all care flies, the peace of mind, who can soothe the hearts of men wearied with the toils of the day, and can refit them for labor. Near Somnus sits Morpheus, one of his many sons, who watches over his slumbers and sees that no one shall break upon his sleep. This god holds a vase in one hand, and with the other he shakes the nodding poppies that bring drowsiness and sleep. Sometimes he assumes varied forms in which he appears to men at night, and always he flies through the darkness with wings that make no noise. Around the couch of Somnus hover the shadowy forms, the dreams, which are as numerous as the forest leaves or sands upon the seashore. In the distant corner of the room lurk the horrid nightmares, which creep out of the cave to visit sleeping mortals, but are never led to earth by Mercury, as are welcomed dreams. 2 gates lead out of the Valley of Sleep, one of the horn and one of the ivory. Mors, the god of death, occupies one of the rooms in the Cave of Sleep. He is a fearful-looking deity, cadaverous as a skeleton, and wrapped in a winding sheet. He holds an hourglass in one hand, and a sharp scythe in the other, and stands watching the sand run out of his glass, that he may know when a human life is nearing its end. Then, as the last grains fall, he glides from the valley of sleep, and stalks silently and unseen upon the earth, where he cuts down the unhappy mortal, who cannot even hear the rustle of his garments as he approaches. It is nothing to him whether the life he takes belongs to childhood or youth, for he mows them down as relentlessly as he does tottering old age. And to the rich he is as unsparing as to the poor. The divinities who dwelt in the cave of sleep were distrusted by the ancients, and Mors was held in universal dread. No homage was ever offered to him, and no temples were dedicated to his honor, though sacrifices were sometimes made to ward off his dreaded coming. He was never represented in art, except in a pleasing aspect, for although they believed him to have in reality the fearful appearance that tradition ascribed to him, yet the beauty-loving Greeks refused to have this kind of horror embodied in marble. So, when death appears in sculpture, it is usually with his brother Sleep, and both are represented as sleeping youths, whose heads are crowned with poppies or amaranths, and who hold inverted torches in their listless, cold hands. Neptune and the Sea Gods. In the days when the Titans ruled the universe, Oceanus, with his wife Tethys, controlled all the lakes, rivers, and the seas. But when the Titans were overthrown, Neptune took possession of this great kingdom, and old Oceanus reluctantly gave up his dominion over the waters of the earth. Though anxious to assert his supreme authority, Neptune allowed some of the descendants of the Titans to keep their small kingdoms, on the condition that they own allegiance to him as their ruler. Among these was Nereus, the son of Oceanus, who was celebrated for his vast knowledge, his gift of prophecy, and his love of truth and justice. He and his wife Doris, also a child of Oceanus, had 50 daughters, called Nereids, and they were so beautiful that Neptune chose one of them, named Amphitrite, for his wife. There were 2 others of the Nereids who became famous: Galatea, beloved of the Cyclops, Polyphemus, and Thetis, the mother of Achilles. But none of them equaled Amphitrite in beauty. When Neptune first went wooing the Nereid, she was frightened by his formidable appearance, for he drove in a chariot drawn by huge sea horses with brazen hoofs and golden manes, and the god himself carried his terrible trident or 3-pronged spear, which he shattered the rocks, and commands of the storms, and shakes the shores of the earth. None knew better than Amphitrite the extent of Neptune's power, for she had often watched him, when a storm was at its height, raise his all-compelling trident, and immediately the waves would cease raging, and there would be a great calm. Sometimes she saw a ship, doomed by the sea god to disaster, gliding confidently in quiet waters, when all at once a fierce storm would break over its head, and the hapless sailors, as they breasted the angry waves, would pray vainly to Neptune for help that would never come. Many a good ship had nearly gained her port, when he spake, and round about him called the clouds, and roused the ocean, wielding in his hand the trident, summoned all hurricanes of all the winds, and covered the earth and sky at once with mists, while from above the night fell suddenly. When Aphrodite saw this imposing-looking god driving toward her, she was frightened by so much splendor, though she could not help admiring Neptune himself, with his sea-green beard, and his long flowing hair crowned with shells and seaweed. Since the enamored god could never come near enough to plead his suit, he sent one of his dolphins to do the wooing, and this was so successful that the fair Nereid was persuaded to become Neptune's wife, and share his golden throne in the heart of the sea. To reward the dolphin for its skill in having won for him his much-desired bride, Neptune placed it in the sky, where it forms a well-known constellation. Though Neptune had undisputed control over all the waters of the earth, and over all that moves through the paths of the sea, he once aspired to greater power, and even plotted to dethrone Jupiter himself. But the ruler of gods and men discovered his wicked plans, and to punish him, deprived him of his kingdom for some years, during which time he was obliged to submit to the humiliation of serving Laomedon, the king of Troy. It was while he was in service here that he sought Apollo's help in building the great walls of Troy, whose stones fell into place under the spell of the sun god's music. Laomedon had promised Neptune a large reward if the wall was built within a certain time, but when it was finally finished, he refused to pay the sum agreed upon. Though angered at this treachery, Neptune had to endure the king's injustice until his years of service were over. But as soon as he was restored to his former power, he created a terrible sea monster, which spread terror and death all over the land. Not knowing how to meet this calamity, the Trojans consulted an oracle, and were advised to sacrifice to the monster a beautiful maiden each year, and so prevent the wrath of Neptune from overwhelming the whole country in disaster. Reluctantly, the sorrowing people prepared to obey the oracle, and a victim was chosen by lot, and led by the priest to a large rock on the seashore, where she was securely chained. And then the hideous sea beast glided out of its cave in the slimy rocks and devoured her. Every year this terrible ceremony was repeated, and at last the lot fell on Hesione, the king's only daughter. Laomedon tried in vain to save her, but the lot was cast, and nothing could avert the appointed sacrifice. In despair, the wretched father saw the fatal hour approaching, and when the day drew near when Hesione was to be led down to the sea, he forgot his avarice, and proclaimed throughout the land that a great reward would be given to anyone who could slay the monster. Hercules appeared just in time to save the doomed maiden, and killed the monster with his oaken club as it was dragging Hesione to its cave. The king was overjoyed at his daughter's rescue, and told Hercules that he may claim a reward. But even when he saw the hero come with the beast's head as proof he had slain it, he refused to part with his much-loved gold. So Hercules returned home, but he did not forget Laomedon's perfidy, and when later he came to Troy, he killed the king and took his children captive to Greece. Neptune, like all immortals, loved more than once, and among those who shared his affections was a maiden named Theophany, who had so many suitors that it kept the jealous sea god in constant fear, lest she should prefer some earthly lover. So he took her to the island of Cremisa, and there changed her into a sheep, while he carried on his wooing in the form of a ram. The offspring of this marriage was the famous golden-fleeced ram, whose pelt was the object of that ill-fated expedition, led by Jason and his fellow Argonauts. Neptune also loved the goddess Ceres, and following her during a long period of time that she spent in search of her daughter, Prosperina. Ceres was angered by the sea god's persistent wooing, and hoping to escape from him, she took the form of a mare. But Neptune was not so easily discouraged, for he changed himself into a horse, and contentedly trotted after her. The child of this strange pair was Arion, a wonderful winged steed that had the power of speech, and with such incredible swiftness that nothing could equal it in speed. But the most famous children of Neptune and Aphrodite were Triton and Proteus. Triton was his father's trumpeter, and at Neptune's command he blew upon his conch shell to calm the restless sea. His body was half man and half fish, and he gave the name of Tritons to all his male descendants, who, with the Nereids and the Oceanides, daughters of Oceanus, followed the chariot of Neptune when he went abroad to view his kingdom. Proteus had charge of the great flock of sea calves which fed on the soft seaweed and basked in the warm sands near his cave. He was celebrated for his wisdom, and for all the truth of the answers he gave to those fortunate enough to make him speak. Homer calls him the Ancient of the Deep, whose words are ever true. But his knowledge was not easy to obtain, for he had the extraordinary power of assuming any shape that he pleased, and only those mortals gained his advice who persistently clung to him through his many bewildering changes. Aristaeus was the son of Apollo and the water nymph Cyrene. Beside tending his flocks and herds, he took care of the olive trees and vineyards, and was a famous keeper of bees. He was very proud of his hives, and the swarm of bees increased each year under the guidance of his skillful hands. But one day he found hundreds of bees laying lifeless beside the hives, and on the morrow there were still more among the dead. Not knowing how to account for this disaster, Aristaeus hurried to his mother to ask her for help in saving the few bees that remained. Cyrene lived under a mountain stream, and, hearing that her son wished to speak to her, she commanded the river to divide and form a wall on either side, so that Aristaeus might walk in the dry places. When the youth told her of the tragedy befalling his hives, she could not help him, but bade him to go to old Proteus, for he alone could tell what the trouble was and find a remedy. She warned Aristeus of the difficulty in holding the Ancient of the Deep when he tried to bewilder and terrify the stranger by rapidly assuming different forms, and she bade him remember that he must keep the sea god fast bound if he would receive the wished-for answers. And then she led him to the cave of Proteus and hid him there, exhorting him to be bold and fearless. At noon, the wizard of the deep came out from the sea, followed by his herd of sea calves, and while they stretched out on the warm sands, the god sought the retreat of his cave and was soon in deep slumber. When Aristeus saw Proteus fast asleep, he stepped cautiously up to him and bound him with strong fetters. The god woke with a start and tried to shake himself free of the chains, but on finding he was a prisoner, he resorted to all the trickery that he could command. He became a fire, a flood, a wild beast, a horrible serpent, and many other forms calculated to terrify the beholder. But Aristeus was not afraid, and soon the old wizard realized that he must submit. So he assumed his own shape and asked the youth what it was that he wished to know. The son of Cyrene told him of the death of his bees and begged for some remedy. Then Proteus reminded him of how he had been the real cause of Eurydice's death by making her flee from him in such haste that she did not seek the snake at her feet. The wood nymphs, who were Eurydice's companions, had therefore wished to punish Aristeus, and had sent this destruction to his hives. It was necessary to appease the wrath of the nymphs, and to do this Proteus bade the youth build 4 altars, and sacrifice on them 4 bulls and 4 cows of perfect form and size. This burnt offering was to placate the nymphs, and when it was made, he must pay funeral honors to Orpheus and Eurydice to pacify their anger against him. At the end of 9 days, he was to return to the grove where he had made the sacrifices. Aristeus thanked the Ancient of the Deep for his wise words, and after releasing him from the fetters, hurried away to do as Proteus had advised. The sacrifices were made, and suitable honors paid to the dead, and then, after waiting impatiently for 9 long days, Aristeus went back to the grove. To his great joy, he found that a swarm of bees had taken possession of the carcasses, and that he was now the owner of a much larger number than he had ever dreamed of having before. One of the many sea gods who ruled under Neptune was Glaucus, who was once a poor fisherman and earned his living by selling the fish that he caught each day. One morning he had an extra large haul, and when he threw the fish on the ground beside him, he noticed that they were eagerly nibbling the grass that grew very thickly in the spot where he had flung his net. As he stood watching them, the fish suddenly leaped up from the ground, and having flopped back into the water, swam away. Curious to see whether it was the grass that gave them this extraordinary power, Glaucus chewed a bit of it himself, and immediately he felt an irresistible desire to plunge into the sea. Fearlessly he dived beneath the waves, and soon found no difficulty in keeping under water, for the ocean seemed now to be his native element. He saw his beard turning a lovely sea green, and he found that his hair, grown suddenly long and green, was trailing out behind him. His arms were azure-colored, and his legs became a fish's tail, but he felt no regrets over losing his human form and stayed contently in the ocean. In time, Neptune made him one of the lesser gods, and took him into the friendly fraternity of the sea. As Glaucus was swimming one day near the shore, he saw a beautiful maiden named Scylla, and he fell so much in love with her that he forgot he was half fish, and begged her to be his wife. Scylla stared at his green hair and blue skin, but this did not frighten her, nor did she wonder at his fish's tail, for you see she had often played with the sea nymphs, and was accustomed to their strange appearance. Glaucus felt encouraged by her behavior, and begged her to listen to the story of his life. He told her how he had suffered a sea change, and now occupied the lofty position of a god. The maiden was interested in his recital, but she had no desire to marry a merman, even if he were a god. So when Glaucus ventured to come nearer to her, she turned and fled. Discouraged, but still determined, the young god sought the aid of the enchantress Circe, and begged her to give him some love potion by which she might win the unwilling heart of Scylla. Circe was so well pleased with the handsome sea god that she urged him to accept her love and forget the maiden who scorned him, but Glaucus would not yield into the persuasions of the enchantress, and kept pleading for the desired love potion. Seeing that she could not gain his affections, Circe determined that at least no one else should enjoy them, so she refused to make the potion, and sent Glaucus angrily away. When she saw him go sorrowfully from her palace, she mixed a magical liquid, brewed from poisonous plants and deadly weeds, and this she poured over the waters where Scylla was wont to bathe. The maiden, suspecting no treachery, sought the ocean at her accustomed hour, and as soon as the poisoned waves touched her body, she became a horrible monster with 6 heads, each having 3 rows of sharpened teeth. She saw all around her serpents and barking dogs that were part of her own body, which had suddenly become rooted to the spot where she stood. She never regained her human form, but stayed in this place forever, to terrify all mariners, and to devour the hapless sailors that came within her reach. Opposite her was the den of Charybdis, who 3 times a day swallowed the waters of the sea, and 3 times threw them up again. On the rock above the den was an immense fir tree, and all ships that passed that way watched eagerly for this signal of danger, and prayed that they might safely steer between the double horrors of Scylla and Charybdis. 2 other minor deities of the sea were Leucothea and Palemon. They were not born of the ocean nymphs or any water gods, but they were once mortals, named Ino and Melicertes. Ino was the wife of King Athamas, whom cruel Juno goaded into madness, and through fear of him, Ino fled from the palace with her little son Melicertes in her arms. She hoped to reach some place of safety, but imagining herself pursued in her frenzy, she plunged off a cliff's edge into the sea. Neither she nor her son perished, however, for the gods, in pity of her sufferings, changed them both into ocean deities under the names Laocothea and Palemon. They were widely worshipped by all who had business in those great waters, and their protection was invoked against the danger of the shipwreck. A famous altar to Palemon was built on the shores of Corinth, and in his honor were instituted the celebrated Isthmian Games. Neptune was not only willing to befriend a goddess in distress, as he did when he raised the island out of the sea for Latona, but was equally ready to assist mortals, especially in their affairs of love. Once he lent his chariot to a youth named Eurydice, when he wished to elope with the maiden Marpessa, whose father had refused to allow the lovers to wed. They were overjoyed at Neptune's kindly offer of assistance, and on the day arranged for their flight, the happy pair mounted the chariot, and the swift steeds carried them far out of reach of Marpessa's angry father. When he discovered that his daughter had eloped with her lover, he started in pursuit, but finding it impossible to overtake Neptune's splendid horses, he flew into such a rage that he flung himself into a river and drowned. The river was afterwards called by his name, Evenus. Knowing themselves out of reach of the irate father, the lovers continued their journey very happily, and believed that no misfortune could overtake them, when suddenly Apollo appeared before them, and, declaring himself in love with Marpessa, offered to fight Eurydice then and there for the possession of the maiden. Poor Eurydice felt his chances for happiness were indeed ended, for how could a mortal contend with an omnipotent god? But suddenly a thunderbolt fell from the blue sky above, and a voice declared that Marpessa herself should choose between the two suitors. The maiden looked at the glorious sun god, and her heart beat fast at the thought of being loved by one so beautiful and young. And when she turned to Eurydice, she remembered that he was a mortal like herself, who would grow old as she grew old, and would therefore not cast her aside when her youthful charm was gone, as Apollo would be sure to do as soon as her beauty had waned. So she held her hand out to Eurydice, and refused the god's love. This choice was approved by Jupiter, and the lovers, happy once more, urged Neptune's swift horses over the mirror-like sea, which the kindly god had made calm as a forest pool on the softest summer day. In time they reached a pleasant land far from their native country, and here they lived happily ever afterward. The chariot, no longer needed, was sent back to Neptune, with many thanks for his timely aid, and each year Eurydice and Marpessa burned as sacrifices to their protector a white bull, a white ram, and a white boar, which was the kind of offering that was most pleasing to Neptune.